Good afternoon. I'm Roger Bagnall, the president of the American Philosophical Society, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to Philadelphia and the Autumn General Meeting. This is a very special occasion as we will be celebrating Bob Hauser's successful, even glorious term as executive officer, and welcoming back Patrick Spero, who will take over as Chief Executive Officer on the 1st of January. It's an exciting time, and it's an exciting time for this meeting. We have a record 380 people registered for the meeting, the first time we've hit numbers in this stratosphere since before the pandemic. Thank you all for being here. And we also have 29 members attending their first APS meeting. They will be formally inducted in 3 groups today, tomorrow, and Saturday. They are wearing pink name tags, and if you're a veteran in particular, I urge you to take the opportunity to give them a warm welcome. Now, housekeeping, as always. I'm sure you're all smart, sensitive people, and you have turned off your cell phones. But just in case you have forgotten. And secondly, I have to do my Amtrak announcement. This is a sold-out train, and you cannot use the seat next to you to hold your bags. I can't tell you to put them in the overhead compartment, but under your seat, perhaps, would do the job. We begin our proceedings, as always, with the names of the members whose deaths we have recorded since the last meeting, and I'll ask you to stand as I read their names. John Boardman, on May 23rd, 2024, at age 96, elected in 1999. John Brauman, on August 23rd, 2024, at age 86, elected in 2004. Leon Cooper, on October 23rd, 2024, at age 94, elected in 1973. Robert Denard, on April 23rd, 2024, at age 91, elected in 1997. Wolfram Fischer, on April 28th, 2024, at age 96, elected in 1995. Joseph Gall, on September 12th, 2024, at age 96, elected in 1989. Diane Griffin, on October 28th, 2024, at age 84, elected in 2018. John D. Hawkins, on February 1st, 2024, at age 83, elected in 1998. Sung-Dao Lee, on August 4th, 2024, at age 97, elected in 1972. Barbara Oberg, on September 14th, 2024, at age 82, elected in 1998. Brunilde Ridgway, on October 19th, 2024, at age 94, elected in 1993. Malvin Ruderman, on July 20th, 24, at age 97, elected in 1996. James Scott, on July 19th, 2024, at age 88, elected in 2020. James Simons, on May 10th, 2024, at age 86, elected in 2007. Maxine Singer, on July 9th, 2024, at age 93, elected in 1990. Frank Stella, on May 4th, 2024, at age 87, elected in 1999. Shlomo Sternberg on August 23rd, 2024, at age 88, elected in 2010. Edward Stone on June 9th, 2024, at age 88, elected in 1993. Lubert Stryer on April 8th, 2024, at age 86, elected in 2006. Warren M. Washington on October 18th, 2024, at age 88, elected in 2003. Patty Jo Watson on August 1st, 2024, at age 92, elected in 2000. John Wilmerdine on June 6th, 2024, at age 86, elected in 2006. Thank you. We now begin the induction of new members, and I turn the floor over to Dr. Hauser.
So, will Dr. Cynthia M. Bell please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President. And there's a little bit of a contest here for who among our inductees has waited the longest to appear on stage here. And Cynthia, who was a pal of mine of long standing, was elected to membership in the Society in 2001. But here she is, and most welcome. Mr. President, I have the honor to present Cynthia M. Bell, Distinguished University Professor, S. Idell Pyle, Professor of Anthropology Emerita, and Professor of Anatomy at Case Western Reserve University. She is a distinguished anthropologist who, along with her collaborator, Dr. Goldstein, has been interested in the impacts of high altitude on the physiology and socio-cultural behavior of people living in such environments. She has studied populations in Tibet, the Andean countries, and Ethiopia, and is one of the world's leading authorities on this subject. She was the first to thoroughly document the use of different biological pathways by Andean and Tibetan highlanders. Additional research has detected natural selection occurring in modern Tibet and identified a key role for nitric oxide gas at high altitude. And she is a recipient of the Franz Boas, another member, of course, Distinguished Achievement Award from the Human Biology Association.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Now,
so we get together here.
Come here. Thank you.
Congratulations, Cynthia. Will Mr. John Fry please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present John Fry, 15th President of Temple University. He's an innovative, strategic, and nationally recognized leader in higher education. Prior to joining Temple earlier this year, he served as president of Drexel University, where he set out to transform Drexel into a comprehensive research university with a strong public purpose, an institution that harnesses its strengths in cooperative education, translational research, online education, entrepreneurship, and urban extension to serve its students, neighborhood, the city, and the nation. This included the recent merger between Drexel and Salus University, expanding Drexel's graduate degree programs. Under his leadership, Drexel has helped lead the revitalization of West Philadelphia, spearheading the designation of this area as a federal promise zone. He's also served as chair of the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Philadelphia and as a board member of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Orchestra Association, the Kresge Foundation, Lafayette College, and the Advanced Functional Fabrics of America.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Come over here.
Congratulations. Great to meet you.
Thank you.
Will Dr. Wick C. Haxton please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Wick C. Haxton, Distinguished Professor of Physics at the University of California, Berkeley, Senior Faculty Scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington. He currently directs the National Science Foundation's Physics Frontier Center on multi-messenger astrophysics at UC Berkeley, and previously served as the first director of the Institute for Nuclear Theory at the University of Washington, the Department of Energy's national center for that field. In that role, he established the Bagnall Committee, whose recommendations led to the creation of a U.S. facility for deep underground science in South Dakota. His research focuses on low-energy tests of fundamental symmetries and on neutrino astrophysics, impacting multiple subfields of physics, including nuclear and particle physics, astrophysics, atomic physics, and condensed matter. He is a recipient of the American Philosophical Society's Hans Bethe Prize.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Please come, no,
We have to come on over. Let's have a picture.
you need a photo. Photo.
Will Dr. Danny Jacobs please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Danny Jacobs, 5th President of Oregon Health and Science University. He's a renowned surgeon scientist who focused his research on the effects of critical illness and malnutrition on cellular bioenergetics, pardon the term. Bioenergetics, thank you. He has been a member of 12 editorial boards, including the New England Journal of Medicine, Surgery, and World Journey of Surgery. In addition to his surgical career, he has excelled as a leader at top academic institutions. While at the University of Texas, he oversaw the schools of medicine, nursing, health professions, and biomedical sciences. He also chaired the school's $450 million capital campaign and the faculty group practice, comprising 681 beds, 77 ambulatory sites, and a $2.2 billion annual budget. At the Oregon Health and Science University, he led the school out of the pandemic, overseeing a zero-margin budget, we've heard about those, and shepherding the Science University to become a U.S. News and World Report top hospital in Oregon, among the 50 top hospitals nationwide, and one of the top children's hospitals in the country. He's the recipient of the National Medical Association's Presidential Award.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. And
Congratulations. Great to meet you.
And I'm really thrilled to have a member in Oregon. We've been very short on Northwest members, so this is a really good thing.
Will Dr. Patricia A. McAnany please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Patricia A. McAnany, Kennan Eminent Professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, a Maya archaeologist. She is a co-investigator of Proyecto Arqueológico Colaborativo del Oriente de Yucatán. Thank you. A community-engaged archaeology project focused on the pre-classic through contemporary community in Tacabo, Yucatan. As the executive director of a University of North Carolina Chapel Hill program called Inherit, Indigenous Heritage Past to Present, past, P-A-S-S-E-D, to present. She works with local communities throughout the Maya region and beyond to provide opportunities to talk about cultural heritage and magnify Native voices in education and heritage conservation. She is the recipient of the A.V. Kidder Award from the American Anthropological Association and has received both research and community impact grants from NSF and all sorts of other wonderful places.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Come over here for the photo now. Come forward just a little bit. Yeah.
I hope I didn't butcher that too badly. Congratulations. Will Dr. Ruth Scodell please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Ruth Scodell, D.R. Shackleton Bailey Collegiate Professor of Greek and Latin Emerita from the University of Michigan. She is a scholar of classical literature, bringing Homeric studies a breath of fresh air through innovative applications and of theoretical approaches like cognitive studies and narrative theory, while also demonstrating mastery of traditional analytic methods. Her interests extend to Hellenistic poetry and the reception of Greek tragedy in modern performance and movies. She's a member, former vice president for publications, and former president of the Society for Classical Studies, and a member and former president of the Classical Association of the Middle West and South.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations.
What?
Here.
What?
We gotta get Bob over.
Oh, I skipped O'Toole? Let's find him.
Bob, photo.
Hello. we have, not everything is electronic. And paper sticks together. That's the problem we're facing today. So, will Mr. Finan O'Toole please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Did I pronounce that correctly, more or less? Finton. Yeah. Oh, I left out the T. Okay, thank you. Mr. President, I have the honor to present Fintan O'Toole, columnist and critic for the Irish Times, an advising editor and commentator on U.S. affairs for one of my favorite publications, the New York Review of Books. His memoir, We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Ireland Since 1958, combines personal history with a history of modern Ireland over the last 6 decades, earning recognition of one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2022, an Irish Times #1 bestseller, and winning 2021 Book of the Year at the Irish Book Awards. He's a member of the Royal Irish Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he is a recipient of the Orwell Prize for Journalism and the Robert B. Silvers Prize for Journalism, think again of the NYRB, and the Irish Society of Boston Gold Medal.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you.
That completes that. Okay, you
It's
ready?
my turn.
Okay, I'm happy now to hand the lectern over back to Bob, who will introduce the first speaker.
It is an unmitigated pleasure for me to introduce Yu Xie, Bert G. Kerstetter 66, University Professor of Sociology, Princeton University, to present his talk, The True Colors of China, Yellow, Red, and Blue. I've known Yu Xie for just about 40 years, since he simultaneously completed master's degrees in the history of science and in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Xie's areas of interest range widely, from social stratification to research methods and statistics, demography, sociology of science, AI, and, as you'll hear this afternoon, studies of China. He's prolific as a researcher, teacher, editor, and organizational innovator. From 1989 to 2015, Yu Xie served at the University of Michigan, where he was simultaneously professor of sociology, professor of statistics, and professor at the Survey Research Center, Institute for Social Research. He's also an elected member of Academia Sinica, the Taiwanese Academy of Sciences. At Michigan, Yu Xie also served as major professor for my son Seth, who's somewhere out there in the distance. And thus, depending on whether you think genealogically or academically, Seth is either my son or my grandson. Figure it out. Late in his time at Michigan, he was named Otis Dudley Duncan Distinguished University Professor. Dudley Duncan was a member of the APS and also my mentor at the University of Michigan, and a close friend and intellectual colleague of Yu Xie. Beginning around 2006, maybe I'm wrong about the year, Xie developed relationships with Chinese universities, notably Peking University, Beida. By 2011, he was named visiting chair professor. He's also an adjunct professor at several other leading Chinese universities. Most importantly, he is both chair of the Academic Advisory Committee, Institute for Social Science Surveys at Beida, and director of its Center for Social Research. He led the creation of a state-of-the-art longitudinal household survey of all China, including some 12,000 households, the China Family Panel Study. It has collected data biennially covering every member of each household over the age of 9 since 2012. The survey contents were designed to resemble 3 important American studies: the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, and the Health and Retirement Study. All data are documented both in Chinese and English and publicly available as soon as they leave the field. There are close to 100,000 users of those data worldwide. In 2015, Yu Xie moved to Princeton, where he founded the Wythes Center on Contemporary China, which is active in education, training, and research, both here and internationally. If you have listened closely to this account, you will understand that Professor Xie has been adept at the complicated politics of research, both in the United States and in China. Yu Xie.
So, as Bob says, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Patrick Spero, particularly for those who are new to this society. Patrick will become our Chief Executive Officer at the start of 2025 and is already hard at work on some of our most important initiatives. He is no stranger to the APS. He began his academic career as a postdoctoral fellow at the Society, where he spent 2 years surveying the Society's vast manuscript holdings from the period before 1850 and designing the library's first digital guide. One begins to get a sense already of the intellectual and organizational ambition. Undeterred by this experience, Patrick returned to the APS in 2015 and served for 8 years as our librarian, and after we unified these units, the director of the library and museum. And so now he comes back for a third time to lead the Society as our CEO. Patrick is an award-winning historian, not simply an administrator, author of 4 books: Frontier Country, The Politics of War in Early Pennsylvania, which was named a staff pick by the Philadelphia Inquirer in 2017, Frontier Rebels, The Fight for Independence in the American West, winner of the Philadelphia Athenaeum's Literary Award, The Other Presidency, Thomas Jefferson and the American Philosophical Society. And we know that Jefferson, of course, was president of the APS for much longer than of the United States, published by our own press. And finally, his newest book, The Scientist Turned Spy, which is the subject of his talk today. So please join me in welcoming Patrick. Thank you, Roger.
Well, thank you, Roger. It's great to be back. I think it was a little over a year ago, I was standing on this stage, leaving as a librarian of the Philosophical Society, heading down south for a brief foray to George Washington's Mount Vernon as the director of their presidential library. And I stood on this stage, and I see Linda with Linda, and I said being librarian of the Society was maybe the greatest honor of my professional life. I was telling you the truth at the time, but it is an incredible honor to be back in this new role, and I'm really excited not only for to be back, but most especially for the future of the Society. And when people ask me, well, you come back to the Philosophical Society, why do you want to go back? You just left that place. And the truth is, it is so much fun working with you all and the members. The work the Society does is absolutely inspiring, and I cannot wait to work with you all more in the future in a range of new ways in this new role. So thank you all for your trust. I also want to say a little something about Bob Hauser. The Hauser Fest, I know, officially starts after I talk, but we had Yoshia before, and Yoshia mentioned what it was like to have Bob as a mentor. I want to talk a little bit about what it's like to have Bob as your boss. Which is very good. So the large majority of my tenure as librarian, Bob was the executive officer, and Bob and I worked on a lot of projects, big and small, easy and difficult. Bob, Linda, and my wife all shared COVID together. But there's going to be a lot of talk about what Bob has accomplished as executive officer, and I want to share something that might not appear in the written record, and that's Bob's generosity. I think one of the defining elements of Bob as executive officer was how much time, his own time, he was willing to invest in the Society. And especially I saw that when he engaged with new and young scholars. The library hosts a whole range of programs to help develop early career scholars. We have weekly brown bags, we have manuscript workshops for pre-docs and people working on their first books. And Bob, who had so much to manage as executive officer, would always try and make an attempt to attend each one of these. And even though Bob is a sociologist, a demographer, many of these works were historians far afield from what he knew, he always made great and incisive comments. And when there was something that he could, that called on his own scholarship, he'd make an extra point to reach out to those fellows, to have lunch with them, to talk with them, to really invest in the future. And I was USHIA received that type of support. I did as librarian as well. This book that I'm going to talk about, the very first reader of it was Bob Hauser. And he was very critical and helpful. So I think, when I think about Bob, he is what I think is the highest compliment for a scholar. He is a generous scholar. He is the embodiment of a generous scholar, investing in others. And the one thing that we can't get more of is time. And Bob was willing to invest his time in the next generation. So I want to thank you, Bob, and I think the society also owes you a debt of gratitude. So thank you, Bob. So speaking of time, there is a clock, if you don't know, that's staring at you. That's telling you how much time you have left to speak, and mine is narrowing. But what's interesting is we're running a little bit ahead of time, and I just told you you can't get more time, but in fact, they gave me 5 extra minutes, if that's okay with all of you. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about this book, which is deeply rooted in the society, in the society's history, in the society's work, and in the society's collections. In fact, we've pulled some treasures here that you all can look at later that really informed the development of this book. So I want to start with talking about how I came to write the book that I did. And the document you're looking at, which is up here, is one of the Society's national treasures. It's the Michaux subscription list. By show of hands, how many people here have seen this before? A fair number, but not as many as I thought. So let me tell you what this document says. This is one of my favorite, as a librarian, you get to give these treasure tours, and that was the real fun of the job. You're stuck behind the desk with email 95% of the day, but every once in a while you got to give a treasure tour, and that's what made it really exciting. And this was one of my favorite documents to show. So what you're looking at in that top half, that handwriting is in Thomas Jefferson's hand. It was written in 1793, in the early months of 1793. Jefferson at the time was the vice president of the Philosophical Society and the Secretary of State of the United States, located here in Philadelphia. And what it says, you can see there, is whereas André Michaux, a native of France inhabiting the United States, has undertaken to explore the interior country of North America to the Pacific Ocean. So this is Lewis and Clark before Lewis and Clark, 10 years before Lewis and Clark. And in the middle there, that arrow, it says, the said Philosophical Society will take the proceeds thereof and fund this expedition, this transcontinental expedition. And then beneath that, you have the signatures of, on the top there, George Washington, APS member, $100, also, of course, President of the United States at the time. John Adams, beneath it, Vice President, also APS member, elected 1780, $20. Well, I'll say a little something about that in a second, actually. And then in the middle, you've got Thomas Jefferson, the third president, $50. Beneath him, Hamilton, also $50, would not be outdone by Jefferson, of course. And then on the far side, you have James Madison, all right, the fourth president. So this is believed to be the only document to contain the first 4 presidents' signatures on it. Now, what's really remarkable is that this document itself was only rediscovered in the Society's vaults in 1979, when a high school intern was going through the vaults on a summer project, came across this cache of papers, realized that opening them up was probably above his pay grade, so he walked them over to the librarian's office, who at the time was Whitfield Bell. Whit unfurled this scroll and realized he had a national treasure on his hand. Now, you all laughed at John Adams, so here's a sidebar. He offered $20. Now, I don't mean to say too much negative about Jefferson. You're going to hear a little bit today. I'm warning you. But at least John Adams probably had that $20 to give, right? Jefferson was always in debt. So I told this story all the time in treasure tours, and I always wrapped it up. People would say, so what happened? What happened to this endeavor? And I would summarize what is on our website. Ultimately, the expedition was called off due to diplomatic difficulties with France, which owned much of the territory to be explored. So it kind of just dissipated. Nothing happened. So fast forward to the pandemic, April in 2020. If you all remember that period of time, I mean, I know we don't want to remember it, but if you remember April 2020, we're thinking, this is only going to be a couple weeks, maybe a month or so. So the society decided to host an event in San Francisco in September of 2020, and they asked me to give a talk about the Michaux subscription list. They said, you talk about it so well, why don't you expand on that talk and give a talk to some members, some guests, and so forth. And I thought, oh, this is great. This is an easy pandemic project. I've always wanted to investigate this a little bit. So I started to explore, and I approached this document with 4 questions. Who was Andre Michaux? What is the story of the subscription list? What happened to it? And did it matter? What's its legacy? And the truth is, as we know, September 2020, we were still bound in our houses, so I never gave that 40-minute talk. I ended up writing a 400-page book, and here I am giving a 20-minute talk to you all. So what I want to do is briefly walk us through each one of these questions to share with you some of the things I learned. So first, who was Andre Michaux? Michaux was one of the leading botanists of his generation. He was probably one of the greatest scientific explorers also of his generation, on par, I think, or at least in the league of James Cook and Lewis and Clark, but he's certainly not as well known as either of those or any of those. His name is largely unknown except for those that are in his field of botany and historians of science. This is not an image of Andre Michaux. There is actually no extant image of Andre Michaux, which I think says a lot about how forgotten he is. This is actually an incredible drawing we found in a French botanist papers here in the library, and it's a picture of what a botanist would look like when they're out in the field conducting their research. So even though I didn't know what Michaux looked like, I often had that picture in my mind as I was doing my research. So Michaux, so I'll give you a little bit of his early life story. So Michaux was born outside of Versailles on an area called Sartori. It was a farmland that was technically owned by the king, but he'd lease it out to some of his favorite subjects. And Michaux's family was one of those who was fortunate enough to have that patronage. And so Michaux's early life was working on the family farm, and his father intended for his son to follow in his footsteps. This was a stable, middle class, maybe even upper middle class position in France at the time. This is middle 18th century. And Michaux continues on that path. He takes over the farm, he marries, he has a son, and then tragedy strikes. And this is one of the things that is a defining element of Michaux's life, is that he's often redirected by events outside of his control. And in this case, his wife dies just a few months after the birth of his son. And Michaux was cast completely adrift. He's sent into this deep, dark, depressive abyss. His neighbors, his friends, they all write about it. It's in the record. People are worried that he's going to do something drastic. And it doesn't seem like anything can pull him out of this depression until finally a botanist at Versailles approaches Michaux, who he knows has this farmland, and said, would you experiment with some of these seeds I was just sent? See if you can develop them in your farmland and tell me what you find. And what Michaux found was that this work consumed him, but it also consoled him. And the botanist took him under his wing and mentored him, and soon introduced him to the highest scientist in Paris. He started to study at the Royal Garden in Paris. Then he was sent over to London to study in the botanical gardens in London. He then took a number of apprenticeships through the mountains of France and Spain. And finally, he had his real opportunity to prove himself in 1782 when a diplomatic envoy was heading to the Middle East from France, and the king decided to appoint Michaux the botanist for the expedition. And Michaux spent 3 years traveling through the Middle East, through Persia, up to the Caspian Sea, and then back to France. And he arrives at the court of France laden with all of these treasures. He has plant specimens, he has animals, he has ancient artifacts. He even developed what is believed to be the first French to Persian dictionary, to give you a sense on the range of his intellect. And he receives this incredible welcome. All the adulation and acclaim surrounds him. And the French king realizes he has something special on his hands, and he decides to appoint Michaux the royal botanist. Now, for Michaux, this is exactly what he'd been looking for. This is the stable job that his father wanted for him in the farm, but now Michaux sought as a botanist. And what he thought was he's going to have a regular income coming in, and he could pursue botany as he wished, pursue knowledge for its own sake. And so he said to the king, this is great. I just came back from the Middle East. I want to head further east. I know there's a lot more treasures for us to find, things that might be useful to France. And that's where Michaux learned one of his first and important lessons about being a patron of science, receiving patronage. The king said, no, I have much different ideas for you. Instead of heading east, you have to head west, across the Atlantic to the United States. Michaux reluctantly realizes that he has to be loyal to France, follows these orders, and arrives in the United States. Now, the king did this for very important strategic reasons. France, there were two key reasons. First off, France had just fought about 30 years of continuous warfare, beginning first with what we sometimes call the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, and then supporting the American cause during the American Revolution. So France's force had largely been depleted to support their military. And so the king said to Michaux, your number one priority is find sturdy oaks that you can send across the Atlantic and replenish French forests. The second thing he says is, the eastern North America had been controlled by the British, so French science had largely been, inaccessible to French science. So he says, try and find some crops that might be imported and transform French agriculture. And so Michaux was sent over there to do these two things. He arrives in New York City. He establishes 2 botanical gardens, one in New Jersey and another in Charleston, South Carolina. And pretty soon he is completely enthralled with America, and he gives up any wish of going back east. He spends almost 10 years in North America. He discovers over 1,000 new species of plants. He ships across the Atlantic Ocean 50 to 60,000 living specimens back to the French botanical gardens. And you can get some sense of the extent of his travels in North America. He went as far as the Hudson Bay, as far south as Florida, and as far west as the Mississippi River. Now, once and everything went swimmingly for Michaux. He was excited. He was receiving funds from the king. He could do basically anything he wanted, so long as he sent specimens back to France. But then, once again, Michaux was completely redirected by events outside of his control. The French Revolution happens. Michaux's funder is deposed, and so his funds begin to dry up. And Michaux begins to struggle with finances. And by 1792, he's on the verge of bankruptcy, and he's trying to figure out what to do. And he realizes, as the royal botanist, probably the safest place for him is outside of Paris. And so he strikes up on this idea. He sees all this area that he's covered, and he realizes there's this great, vast expanse west that remains unexplored by European scientists. And he realizes if he does this transcontinental trek, he will establish himself in the pantheon of great scientific explorers. And he realizes that in America, if there's one place that might support this type of expedition, it's in Philadelphia, and it's the American Philosophical Society. So he travels to Philadelphia in December 1792. He meets with a group of APS members. We have his journals in our library, and his account of meeting with the Philosophical Society is over in this vitrine over here. He meets with Benjamin Smith Barton. He meets with William Bartram, who's one of his closest friends. They hear this idea and they say, yes, this is exactly what we've been trying to do. As a matter of fact, a year earlier, the APS had tried to do this very expedition, but they couldn't find anybody willing to do it. And they say, the person you need to talk to is Thomas Jefferson. He is the connector between government and science, and he's also a great connector to raise the money to support your expedition. So Michaux meets with Jefferson, he pitches him on his idea, and Jefferson, who had been dreaming about this expedition since it's at least 1783, since in 1783 he tried to recruit George Rogers Clark to do this exact expedition, but he failed to raise the money. So he meets Michaux, he hears all about Michaux's travels, and he realizes, yes, I've got my guy. And so he decides to raise money to support this expedition. This is probably one of the Society's first and one of the largest fundraising initiatives in the early Republic. The Society successfully raises the equivalent of $1.75 million. It's a mix of people in government and also APS members. And so everything is going swimmingly. They raise the money. They're preparing for their expedition. And then Jefferson says to Michaux, we've talked a lot about raising the money and what you need for this expedition, but we haven't actually talked about what you're going to do on this expedition. And he points out to this little clause in the subscription list that he's going to go to the Pacific Ocean or in such other direction as shall be advised by the American Philosophical Society. So Jefferson and the American Philosophical Society say, well, we've raised this money. Michaux, we get to tell you what you should do on this expedition. And the Society does what it often does, but both back then and today. It decided to create a committee Everybody gets that that's here. To come up with the instructions for André Michaux's expedition. And they appoint 6 APS members, 3 of whom were elected in 1768. That's kind of the first crop of revolutionary scientists. And then 3 who are more recent members, like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, and Caspar Wistar. And they sit down, and this is also in our collection. These are the instructions that were given to André Michaux. They're in Thomas Jefferson's hand. And these are the things that they tell Michaux should be his priorities. First off, you should find the fastest route to the Pacific Ocean. Why? Because this is in the commercial interest of the United States. It's like finding the Northwest Passage. They just want to find how quickly can we reach the Pacific and those markets. Second, we want you to look for some animals. Our number 1 priority is a woolly mammoth. And then, if you can, a North American llama. Now, I don't really have time to tell you why they chose those, but it's really interesting and it's really important to the history of science in this period and also our country's history. What I will say is that they gave this to Michaux, and as soon as Michaux sees these, remember, he's a botanist, he's loyal to France, and his real desire in life is just to pursue botany for its own sake, not to have any boss. That's kind of like all of ours. Sorry, Roger. So the APS and Michaux get in these extended negotiations. They come to loggerheads. They cannot agree on the terms of the instructions. It's a total standstill, and we actually have a letter from Michaux expressing his disdain at these instructions here. So Michaux was stuck in Philadelphia. Nothing seems to be happening with the APS. And then once again, Michaux is completely redirected by events outside of his control when this gentleman arrives. Can anybody identify him? Mary Beth Norton? I knew. I was relying on you. Who is he?
Citizen Genet.
Yes, Citizen Genet. Edmond Genet. He is the first representative of the French revolutionary government to come to the United States. He arrives to Philadelphia to both fanfare and disdain. Those that support the French Revolution, this is a great political divide in the early republic. Do you support the French Revolution as a continuation of the American Revolution, or do you think it's a deviation from? And those who supported the French Revolution welcomed Genet. Genet arrived with all these secret instructions and orders that he was to follow, one of which was to mobilize an insurrection in Kentucky. Yeah. Now, you laugh, but wait till you hear what happens. So the reason Genet had these instructions is because the French were then locked in battle with Great Britain and Spain over the future of Europe. Were monarchies going to fall to this French revolutionary fervor, or could monarchies defend their traditions? Now, what the French had heard is that there are these group of these frontiersmen who are angry with their federal government in the East. It ignores their interests. It's just a bunch of elitists and capitalists in the East. And they're willing to renounce their allegiance to the United States, swear their allegiance to the French Revolution, and seize Spanish Louisiana and turn it into an independent republic aligned with France. And the French, they think that they have a real shot at doing this. And if they succeed, it will not only upend geopolitics in North America, they hope it might force the Washington administration, who's been trying to maintain neutrality, to side with the French in their revolution. And so Genet arrives in Philadelphia, and there's this botanist who's sitting around with nothing to do, who also, he learns, is a really great explorer. And he realizes, just like Jefferson did, I've got my man. And so he meets with Michaux, and he says, André, I want you to travel out to Kentucky. I want you to travel under the guise of science, pretend you're conducting these botanical experiments, but I really want you to meet with George Rogers Clark, that same person Jefferson had asked to do this expedition, who has indicated that he's willing to lead this insurrection, this invasion of Spanish Louisiana. And so Michaux is reluctant, but he is nonetheless loyal and agrees to do so. So Genet and Michaux start plotting how they're going to do this. They start acquiring arms that Michaux is secretly going to carry out amongst all of his botanical supplies. But Genet is worried. He says, a Frenchman going out there, people might be suspicious about him. How can I get rid of people's suspicions? And that's where he realizes there's Thomas Jefferson. All right, Jefferson is a great supporter of the French Revolution. He's frustrated with the Washington administration. And Genet and Jefferson had become very quick friends when Genet arrived in Philadelphia. In fact, Genet was one of Jefferson's most frequent correspondents. They socialized all the time. And so Genet said, I think Jefferson might help us in this. Remember, Jefferson's the Secretary of State. So Genet goes out to Jefferson's house on July the 5th in West Philadelphia. And this is Jefferson's handwritten account of what transpired in that meeting. And you can see that Genet called on him, and Edmund Genet told the Secretary of State this entire plot, what he planned to do. And then, at the end, he said, Thomas, can I ask you for a favor as a friend? Will you write a letter of introduction for Andre Michaux and say that he's just out there doing botany and you don't have to worry about anything? And what does the Secretary of State do? He writes that letter of introduction. You can see that in the last line. So to put this in context, this is like the Secretary of State today knowing about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and not only deciding to do nothing, but kind of helping them. So what happens? Michaux travels out west with this passport from the Secretary of State. He meets with George Rogers Clark, who agrees to mobilize this invasion of Spanish Louisiana. He calls on all of his former generals and colonels. And in Kentucky, they mobilize over 2,000 angry frontiersmen. They create their own uniforms. They begin mustering. They start to build boats. They have a whole flotilla of boats because they plan to go down the Mississippi River in them. And there are even reports of iron forges burning brighter because they're smelting more cannons for the invasion. So everything seems to be going as planned for the French. But then a Spanish spy informs the Washington administration of what's going on. Now, mind you, the Secretary of State has known this whole time, right? As soon as Washington finds out, it creates a major crisis for him, both constitutional and foreign policy. For constitutional, it's a question of what authority does the executive officer actually have? Can he suppress this type of action by citizens? And for foreign policy, he knows if this happens, it could completely shatter not just the foreign policy of the United States, but the foundations, the fragile foundations of this republic. So Washington decides to assert executive authority in a way that he previously had been hesitant to doing. He authorizes the U.S. military to use force to suppress this invasion if necessary, but he also sends out agents and other representatives to tell the Kentucky frontiersmen that what they're doing is illegal and they have to stand down. And the anticlimactic end to the story, which always was a challenge for me as a writer, is that it all just kind of dissipates with that because of Washington's decision to exert executive authority in this way. So I want to end. I see my time is now coming to a close with two final thoughts, and that's that fourth question. So did it matter? Did this matter? Because the rebellion just dissipates. And I want to talk about in the last couple of minutes two of the legacies that I think are left here. The first is in the history of the United States. You can see here a Constitution. This is, if you can read it well enough, this is Benjamin Franklin's copy of the Constitution with his annotations on the side. That is also held in our library across the street. And one of the legacies that was left was after everything kind of settled down, those in the federal government that started talking about, well, how do we deal with this type of situation? What is the right authority of the federal government? And they heard the arguments from those in Kentucky, because those in Kentucky who were trying to undertake this action, they had to justify what they were doing. And those in Kentucky made an argument, and it was prominent on the frontier, that citizenship, this new idea of citizenship, everybody before had been subject to a king, that citizenship ended at the country's borders. So you may be an American citizen, but as soon as you travel into another country, you are no longer bound by its policies, by its laws. You are not obligated to it at all. And so what those in Kentucky said, and we have those arguments, is as soon as we cross the Mississippi River, we're just independent citizens of the world who can do whatever we want, and whatever we do will not reflect back on the United States. Now, Washington did not agree with this because he knew that independent citizens like that could completely undermine federal government policy in the country itself. So he, with Congress, which at this time is divided, it's a highly partisan environment, this is something they agree on, they say we need to pass a law that clarifies what citizenship means, what its limits are, what its obligations are. And so in 1795, they passed a law directly as a result of this near rebellion to ensure that something like this would not happen again. And if it did, the federal government did have the authority to suppress it. And this, for me, what this reminds me of is the work of a historian. Never did I think when I started my research in this one document to give a 40-minute talk in San Francisco that my own personal expedition during the pandemic, living vicariously through Michaux, would bring me to such an elemental, fundamental part of the nation's early history, the very idea of citizenship and what it meant. And that also reminds me of how many more stories are waiting to be told in the collections in our library. We have 14 million pages of manuscripts, and if one document could tell this story, just think about all the stories waiting to be told in a library. So, did I lose my last slide, Jeremy? Oh, no, great. So the last thought I want to leave you on is the legacies here at the APS. And I was having a conversation with Governor Wolf before this talk, and he said to me, "Oh, Michaux, do you know there's Michaux State Forest?" And I said, "Yes, and wait till you hear its story." I don't know if we've got the time, but I'll try. Michaux State Forest, okay? What's the story of Michaux State Forest? André Michaux eventually returns to France. He ends up dying in Madagascar. His son, Francois-André Michaux, follows in his footsteps. He becomes a botanist, also becomes a member of the American Philosophical Society. When Francois-André Michaux dies, he has no heirs. He leaves his entire fortune to the American Philosophical Society. The APS receives it in 1870, and they say, what is a pressing problem that we can try and address today? And in the 1870s, the deforestation of the Pennsylvania countryside was a pressing concern. This is the early days of the conservation movement. And so the APS decided to take these funds and hire a lecturer who would travel around the state of Pennsylvania advocating for the need to conserve our forests. And it's in the historic record that he started talking with a small audience of 10 who didn't want to hear this and they weren't interested, and he left with an audience of 300. And after several years, the state decided to create the first Department of Forestry, and they appointed him as its first director. And in recognition for the society's support that he had given to the conservation, he named the first forest Michaux State Forest. And so that's the story of Michaux State Forest, rooted in the APS's own history, not well known. The other legacy, I think, is that this spirit that animated the society to support Michaux really has animated it through its entire existence. The society has always pushed the boundaries of knowledge, wherever that may be. You can see here all of the expeditions that it supported in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it was an innovator in giving out independent research grants to individuals to conduct research. And the Franklin Grants and the Phillips Fund are two of our oldest grants. And it continues in the 21st century. The Society was one of the first places to fund research in astrobiology, pushing us into that next frontier. And so when I think about the Philosophical Society, when I think about this legacy, it's not just about the Society's past, it's also about its present and how vital the Society continues to be today. And it's also one of the reasons I'm so excited to return here. Thank you. And according to the clock, I didn't go that long, so. Great. Any questions? Yeah.
What is the law or legislation that comes out of the XYZ affair for the provenance of citizenship?
What's the relationship between the two? Yeah, I don't know a good answer to that. I often get asked about the Burr conspiracy. So the XYZ affair, it's related. It's about what individuals can do representing the United States abroad. They're related, but they're separate laws. I have not thought about that or explored that. The Burr conspiracy, of course, is what people ask me a lot about. And in fact, this Genet affair and the conspiracy is just part of a pattern that happens in the Kentucky in which there are these near rebellions and attempts to create independent states throughout the early history of the United States. Oh, yep. Hey, Ellen.
Patrick, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. Ellen Cohn, Franklin Papers at Yale. I didn't know any of this. It's just totally amazing. But what I associate Michaux with is, if I'm not mistaken, a 3-volume set of trees of North America. Yeah. So here during your talk, I was feeling very sorry for him because he never got a chance to botanize. But when did he do that work?
So Michaux, this is the story of kind of a deeper story of Michaux. Michaux, after this conspiracy fails, Thomas Jefferson protects Michaux. He's never outed as being implicated at all in this plot. And so Michaux returns to Charleston. Eventually, he continues to lobby for support to do this transcontinental expedition. And all of his friends, especially those in Philadelphia at the APS, they say to him, Andre, if you undertake this expedition, you should do it, but you're probably not going to return. You're probably going to die. And all the work that you've done thus far will be lost to posterity. So what you need to do is go back to France, just publish what you've done, and then come back to America, and we'll support you in your expedition. So Michaux goes back to France, and you can see it, and his friends in France write about it. This is in their correspondence, their memories of him, is that he couldn't publish. He just loved to be in the field conducting work. So he struggles to publish the volumes on oaks in this Silva of North America. He does both two works, one on oaks, which is inspired by this expedition, and another on the Silva. And so he published those. One of those is done posthumously. And then he undertakes an expedition to Madagascar, where he dies. So great. Yeah.
So, why don't you explain why you have the painting of the excavation of the mastodon as part of that display?
Yeah. Well, actually, Bob, you're giving me a chance to talk about the llama and the mammoth. One of Jefferson's obsessions, as many of you probably know, was the mammoth, discovering the mammoth. And the idea behind the mammoth, and trust me, this will get to that dig, there was this transatlantic debate going on over the environment in North America. There was a French scientist who argued that all the plants and animals in North America were weaker than those in Europe. And the idea was that the environment in North America caused things to degenerate. Now, Jefferson, who loved so much about France, also was highly critical of France and thought that's where there's decadence and luxury and decay. And that America was pure, and that's where, things are going to grow. And obviously, this commentary on the environment and the plants and animals was also one on civilization. And so Jefferson was dedicated to trying to find a mammoth, because there were all these fossils that started arriving in Philadelphia from people doing things in the Mississippi River area. And he figured, if I find a mammoth, I'll be able to disprove this theory, because the idea of extinction was not very prominent this time. So he really wanted to discover the mammoth. This then became a major initiative of the Philosophical Society. And what you're seeing in this, what you're seeing in that drawing that Bob was referencing was the APS funding the first successful excavation of a mastodon in the United States by Charles Wilson Peale outside of Newburgh, New York. And the story in the llama is interesting because what's going on there, this is, again, early United States kind of politics. The United States, it declared itself independent from Great Britain, but yet it still felt very dependent on Great Britain, especially economically. And they had to import a lot of wool and woolen goods. They had to import sheep from Europe. And they had heard, the Philosophical Society had heard of a llama that roamed in the Rocky Mountains. And they figured in the same vein that, hey, if we can find a llama with wool that's natural to North America, then that must be better wool than Europe. So they really wanted Michaux to find it. So I see that we're at time now. I just want to point out, for those of you, we're going into a break. There are refreshments in the front and also in the back, and treasures here at the front. We have Michaux's journals that came to us. We have the subscription list. And we also have Thomas Jefferson's instructions to Michaux over here. So thank you all again.
Bella is also, she had signed up for ushering, so I came in and I said to her, I was like, go find Kathy, she is the boss, she will tell you what to do. So,
Give this down to me for
and then the only thing that's going to be important, Michelle is also going to be a little bit in charge, so for her,
Friends, if you could please take your seats, we're going to resume. If you have, by any chance, turned your cell phones back on during the break, please turn them off. It's an enormous pleasure to introduce this next session, featuring two of the Society's longtime members. Judge David Tatel served on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit for 30 years, 1994 to 2024. After graduating from the University of Michigan and the University of Chicago Law School, he served as the founding director of the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and later as director of the National Lawyers Committee. He headed the Office for Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare during the Carter administration. He then founded and led the education practice at Hogan, Lovells, where he is now senior counsel. David was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 2007. David will be joined in conservation by my immediate predecessor as president of the Society, Linda Greenhouse. Linda's senior research scholar in law at Yale Law School, where she taught from 2009 to 2023. She spent 30 years before that, 1978 to 2008, as the Supreme Court correspondent for the New York Times, winning a Pulitzer Prize in journalism for her reporting on the court. And she is my classmate in entry into the American Philosophical Society. So please join me in welcoming David and Linda.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Roger. This is a great treat for both of us. So it was just about a year ago that David asked me if I would consider offering an endorsement, otherwise known as a blurb, for the memoir that he was writing. And of course, when a friend asks you to do that, your heart sinks because, like, what if I don't like it? But so he sent me the first few pages, and I thought, oh my God, this is a wonderful book. And my role here, my very modest role here, is really to be the vehicle for David to tell us some things about his amazing life. So the title of the book, as you know, is Vision, and the epigraph kind of tells the story. It's the definitions of the word vision from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Vision, 1A, the act or power of seeing. 2B, a thought, concept, or object formed by the imagination. So David is going to read the first few paragraphs from the book, and it will give you the flavor of what this story, what his story encompasses. David, over to you.
Thank you. Before I read it, Linda, I just want to say what an enormous privilege this is for me. Linda Greenhouse has been this nation's translator of the Supreme Court for our people. It's a critical role which is now more important than ever, and it's just such a treat for me to have Linda read and discuss my book with me. Well, so thank you, Linda.
Okay.
I've lived a rich and varied life. As a civil rights lawyer, as a federal judge, as a husband of 60 years, as a father of 4, as a grandfather of 8, and now as a great-grandfather. I've spent my professional career in the pursuit of justice, and I could have written a memoir entirely about that pursuit. But unlike most lawyers and judges, I've been blind for over half my life due to a rare inherited disease called retinitis pigmentosa. Throughout my 30 years on the nation's second highest court, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, I could neither read a word of the thousands of legal briefs submitted to my court, nor see the faces of the hundreds of lawyers who argued before me. A blind judge sounds like a cliche, I know, like the Statue of Liberty, wearing a blindfold and holding a scale. But it's no cliche to me. I can't see, but I can listen closely. I didn't need to see the lawyers to hear their arguments. And I absorbed all the written materials by having them read to me, or later by using digital audio devices. For decades, I fooled myself into thinking my blindness was irrelevant to my work and my worth. Only now in my 80s, and in writing this memoir, have I finally come to accept my blindness as an essential part of who I am. This memoir is about my life in the law and my journey into blindness. It's also about the Supreme Court and my great concerns about the state of the judiciary. One more paragraph I want to read, which brings these two threads together. The two threads of this memoir have inverse trajectories. When I was coming of age, I was inspired by the role that lawyers and courts were playing in enforcing the guarantees of our great Constitution. But I was unwilling and unable to deal with my declining vision. Now, a half century later, I've made peace with my blindness, but I'm concerned about the Supreme Court's apparent disregard of the principles of judicial restraint that distinguish the unelected judiciary from the two elected branches of government, and about what that might mean for our planet and our democracy. Braided together, those two threads are my story.
And you see what I mean.
Thank you.
Okay. So, jumping into the meat of this, you talk about learning how to be a judge after many years of law practice when President Clinton put you on the DC circuit. And now you're learning something else. So I want to talk about that a bit. You've learned to be much more forthright than a sitting judge could ever be about the Supreme Court, about your concerns that you just expressed. So what was that like? I mean, has it been liberating? Is it one reason that you retired? I should mention, before David fully retired last year from the court, so he's now a free private citizen, you were for what, a year or two, a senior judge?
Yeah, a year and a half. Right.
A year and a half, which means his departure from full-time status created a vacancy that President Biden could fill. But you were still under the constraints of being a sitting
Yes.
federal judge, and now you're not. So what has that transition been like, felt like? How did you process that?
Well, it's a good question, and it's not something I had actually, Linda, intended to do. When I started the book, I thought I would just write a memoir. I would tell my story. I really didn't understand at that point what writing a memoir really involved and how deeply it required you, if you were going to write a good memoir, to probe deeply into many things, including both my loss of vision and the courts. And the 3 years I worked on this book, my concerns about the Supreme Court have been growing for years. You know that. You and I have talked about it endlessly.
Some of your favorite opinions were the ones that got reversed.
Exactly, right. And so my concerns have been growing for years. But as I worked on this book and had the leisure, the ability to reread not just my opinions, but to go back and read the decisions of the Supreme Court, I became even more concerned. And I gained in that process a deeper, at least I thought, a deeper understanding of what was going wrong here. And I became more comfortable in speaking candidly about it. So it was an evolutionary process. It is actually a result of writing the memoir. I didn't retire to write a criticism of the Supreme Court. That was not my goal. In fact, my goal really was to write a book about both blindness and judging. But as I wrote, I became more comfortable with it and decided in the end to retire for a lot of reasons, only one of which was this book.
Although you say, I'll quote you, frankly, I was tired of having my work reviewed by a Supreme Court that seemed to hold in such low regard the principles to which I've dedicated my life. It had become, quote, an institution I barely recognized. And you can track that through. So to back up,
Yeah.
David was a civil rights lawyer, big time, interspersed with private practice, but really melding the two together. You were a founder of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, right? First in
Yes.
Chicago and then the national,
Yes.
right? So talk a bit about that. We can kind of start with your professional trajectory. What drew you? University of Chicago law graduate, University of Chicago not known for producing civil rights lawyers, you might say. So what was that?
So it goes back to my youth. I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland. My father was a physicist, and when I went to college to the University of Michigan in 1960, my plan was to be a scientist. But I like to say I was captured by the 1960s. It was the height of the civil rights movement. I was fascinated with what was going on in the South, with the freedom rides, the sit-ins. I was totally enthralled with what the Justice Department was doing in the South and the Southern judges. And I was fortunate as a college student to have summer jobs during the Kennedy administration, which from the president on down, hammered home the importance of public service. And so after just a couple years as a science major, I switched to political science. I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. And so I went to law school. And fortunately for me, after I graduated from Chicago and practiced law for a few years, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which President Kennedy had actually called on to be created, opened up an office in Chicago. And I got that job, and that began my 30 years as a civil rights lawyer.
And you traveled in the South. I mean, you handled major litigation.
I did,
And,
yes.
And one of the cases that you write about that was the progenitor for one of the major civil rights precedents was really quite a story in the book. You want to talk about
Sure,
that?
yes.
The Port Gibson case.
Yes, it's in a chapter called Too Beautiful to Burn. And it's the story of the consequences of a boycott. And so in the 60s, the NAACP organized statewide boycotts in Mississippi of white merchants because they wouldn't hire black people. And the merchants retaliated by filing a state antitrust suit against the NAACP and 150 boycotters in a little town called Port Gibson, Mississippi. When Ulysses Grant took Vicksburg and headed east to Jackson, his army marched through Port Gibson. And Grant issued an order to his troops that this town is too beautiful to burn, and they didn't. And the phrase "too beautiful to burn" is on all the lapels of the police and the firefighters. And so the chapter is called "Too Beautiful to Burn." To make a long story short, the merchants filed this civil rights act, this antitrust action, and they won in a state chancery court. They won $1 million judgment against the NAACP, which it could not afford. The NAACP would have gone bankrupt. The press reported the nation's oldest civil rights group on the verge of bankruptcy. Problem under Mississippi law is that you can't appeal a judgment without either paying or posting a bond of 125% of the judgment, which the NAACP couldn't afford. So it was unable to appeal. I represented the NAACP and went into a federal court in northern Mississippi before one of these great southern judges, and we argued that under Mississippi law, the NAACP's inability to appeal denied it its First Amendment rights and its right to access to courts. We won. We won a temporary restraining order, preliminary injunction. It allowed the NAACP to appeal to the Mississippi Supreme Court, where we lost unanimously, as we expected to. 5 years later, it resulted in a major win in the Supreme Court, NAACP v. Claiborne Hardware, a ringing endorsement of the fact that economic boycotts of this kind are protected by the First Amendment. And that decision protects boycotts of this kind today. I tell the story because, and I go back to my beginnings, I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, and I was so impressed with these lawyers who went to the South and argued these cases before these great judges. And here I was, 20 years later, still relatively young, arguing a case like this on behalf of the NAACP in a federal court in Mississippi. It was in many ways, it was a professional thrill of my life as a litigating lawyer.
You write in the book that the lesson you would like young lawyers to draw from your own biography is the need to find a mission and attach yourself to it, a professional mission.
Yeah.
And you write, because this was, your Port Gibson experience was at the time when your blindness was becoming hard to ignore.
Yes.
And so you write, as my vision clouded, the path I wanted to pursue was only becoming clearer. And you tell a number of anecdotes about your efforts to kind of fool people into thinking that you did not have a vision problem.
Yes.
Some of which are extremely poignant. Do you want to tell us some of those?
I'd be happy to. So I was diagnosed with this retinitis pigmentosa when I was 15. But at that point, I still was functioning like a sighted person, Linda. I couldn't see at night very well, and I had growing peripheral problems. But I was functioning pretty much like a sighted person. And when I was diagnosed at the National Institutes of Health, I was 15, I didn't go home and say to my friends, hey, guys, I have this eye disease. I hid it. I didn't tell anybody about it. I didn't want to be different from my friends. I was a little embarrassed by having this. And as I went off to college and law school and developed this mission to be a civil rights lawyer, I worried that my visual disability would adversely affect my professional life. And even in my mid-30s, when the RP deteriorated rapidly, and I began using readers and ultimately using a mobility cane, most of the people here know me from all those years as using a cane. Even then, I never talked about being blind. To put it simply, it wasn't me. I say in the book, I write in the book that when I went on the DC circuit, I wanted to be known as a judge, not a blind judge, but a judge who happened to be blind. And that's a big difference to me. Because I carried this reluctance to deal with blindness into my years on the court, I was determined to spend my tenure on the court to demonstrate that a judge, at least this judge, could function as a good federal judge even without sight. And so that's the story. And I tell all the stories in the book, many of them. You called them poignant, about the ways in which I hid my blindness or my declining sight when I was young, and the way I tried to make it unimportant as I grew older. Those stories appear throughout the book. Some of them are funny, some of them Linda called poignant. As I look back at them, some of them are a little sad.
Well, I'll tell one of them that struck me as poignant, which is when you traveled alone and were navigating your way through an airport, and you needed to use a phone. No, they
Yeah.
didn't have cell phones. A phone to find a public telephone.
Yeah.
You would be guided by the voices of people.
Right.
On the kind of voice that one uses when you're talking on the phone.
Yeah.
And if you heard those voices, you figured that's where the phone must be.
Yes.
Right?
Not until you asked me that question did it occur to me, I could never have done that in the world of cell phones because the pay phones were all in one place. So as I'm walking down the concourse, you know what telephone talk sounds like, right? You can hear it. And I knew there were telephones there.
But of course, if you had you had a cell phone, you wouldn't have needed to find a wall phone.
Well, that's a good point. Excellent point.
Right? But no, I mean, really, we've known each other a long time, although I never knew you before you were blind. But I knew you before you were a judge.
Yeah.
And we never talked about it.
No.
But when we used to run into each other in the DC Metro, many, many mornings we seemed to be on the same time, and we
Right.
would sit, stand together in the subway car, and you would be telling me things that you had read that morning in the New York Times, and I was always just kind of abashed because although I did try to read the Times every day, it was sometimes not until late at night that I got to it. But you had in those early adaptation days, much harder than now, the Times had an audio version that you could log into, and you must have gotten up at 4 o'clock in the morning because you always knew everything that was in that morning's paper. It was.
I love the New York Times, Linda. So.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
But back to your civil rights career. So you go on the D.C. Circuit in the Clinton administration. Clinton, of course, succeeded by George W. Bush, and things started. The legal environment started changing, and you got the assignment in one of the early Section 5 Voting Rights Act cases, the Texas case, the case known as Namudno. Tell us a bit about that, because what is very interesting about that case is, and you point this out kind of gently in the book, but I wonder if you think less gently about it now, that the liberal judges on the court, none of whom were blind, could not see around the corner to what John Roberts was doing in that case. So let's talk about the voting rights.
So maybe just a quick background for everybody. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965, probably the most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed, did many things, but most importantly, it required certain southern states with a history of racial discrimination in voting to submit any change they made in their voting procedures to the Justice Department and prove it wasn't discriminatory. Dramatically successful. They did it under the 15th Amendment, which prohibits discrimination based on voting, and especially Section 2, which is only 12 words, and it gives Congress the authority to enforce the provisions of the amendment through, quote, appropriate legislation. Maybe in my view, Linda, I think those are some of the 12 most important words in the Constitution, because they were added right after the Civil War, and they dramatically changed the relationship between the federal government and the states. They shifted to Congress all the power it needed to rid the country of discrimination based on voting. And 4 times, the Supreme Court sustained the Voting Rights Act under Section 2. The Supreme Court said Section 2 gave Congress all the authority it needed to identify certain states and require them to submit their changes to the Justice Department. My count is 28 or 29 justices, some appointed by by Democrats, some by Republicans. They all agreed. I think there were only 6 or 7 dissents. Flash forward 50 years, Congress extends it again. It comes before the Roberts Court. And the argument, the challenge to this, and I was assigned to the case randomly, but as a district judge, we could talk about those details later. The point is, I had before me as a member of the court the constitutionality of this. I thought this statute was clearly constitutional. For me, as a appeals court judge, Supreme Court precedent had made it clear, and the 15th Amendment was clear. The case was not difficult. And I wrote the opinion ruling that this was constitutional. Well, when I got to the Supreme Court, by the way, the first person I called after I wrote this to find out whether it might go to the Supreme Court was Linda Greenhouse. I didn't ask my colleagues or my law clerks. I quickly called Linda to find out, hey, is this going to go to the court or not? Remember?
Yeah, I do. Not too many judges ever did that.
Right. So the Supreme Court ducked the constitutional question.
On the first round.
Yeah, in this first case, it ducked it. It said, this case was brought by a voting district in Texas, and it ruled that that particular voting district could, what is called bail out, from the Voting Rights Act. So it essentially eliminated the constitutional issue. But the court, in an opinion by the Chief Justice, and this was unanimous, went on to warn Congress that this was unconstitutional. It said it raised serious doubts about the ability of Congress to treat the states differently. It invoked a doctrine called equal sovereignty. It's not in the Constitution. You won't find it there. And the Supreme Court itself had made very clear that equal sovereignty applied only to the admission of the states to the Union. Yet the court invoked this principle to warn Congress that this might be unconstitutional. That was the end of that case. What did Congress do in the next 5 years? Nothing. Here was the most important civil rights law in the books. Congress had been warned by the Supreme Court that at least the court thought it was unconstitutional. They did nothing. And then, should I just go on to Shelby County? Yeah. Okay. So then it comes back to the court, back to my court, and I am again randomly assigned to this. And I, again, write the opinion sustaining the constitutionality of the act. My job as an appeals court judge was to apply existing law, not to predict where the Supreme Court might go. Obviously, it had signaled where it was going, but my job was to look at the court's precedent, the 15th Amendment, and apply existing law. If the court wanted to change it, it had to change it itself. And then it comes back to the Supreme Court, and this time, 5-4, the Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional. Now, and it invokes this equal sovereignty principle. To me, this case is a perfect example of what's wrong with this Supreme Court and how it has departed from basic principles of judging. There's no debate here about the underlying constitutional right like there is, say, in Dobbs. The 15th Amendment is crystal clear. Congress has this authority. But yet the court invoked this court-made principle, applied it to a situation where it doesn't apply. And if you read the Shelby County opinion and compare it to the court's earlier decisions sustaining the law, in the earlier decisions, the court writes about the serious racial discrimination in voting in the South, the harm that discrimination does, the threat to our democracy. Shelby County, it's all about federalism. It's about state autonomy. The court doesn't mention the 15th Amendment until the end of its opinion. It's as if the 15th Amendment had not been added to the Constitution at all, and that what the court was applying was pre-existing constitutional law. It was worried not about the victims of racial discrimination in voting, but about the autonomy of the states, about the fact that the states had to come, as one of my colleagues said, hat in hand to Justice Department to change their laws. If any of these judges were originalists, they would have come out the other way. This is the easiest case I can imagine for an originalist to decide. All you have to do is apply the 15th Amendment, and you're done. But yet, this court, presumably at least thought to be originalists.
And of course, looking back, looking at the pair of cases, the first one that was really a shot across the bow,
Right.
and then the second one that did the deed.
Right.
The first one, I think the vote was 8-1.
8-1.
All
right.
the liberals signed on.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what were they missing?
Well, that, we don't know for sure. I think what happened, first of all, the court, we know this, the court had 2 conferences. That's very unusual. They took a vote, and it was apparently 5-4. And then there were more conversations, and the justices apparently got together again and agreed on a deal, which is that they would not declare the law unconstitutional, but that they would warn Congress. Well, I don't think that, and I don't know this for sure, Linda, but maybe historians will get into the record and find out. I don't know whether the liberals agreed not to write separately to point out what the court was doing, but they didn't. And they sat there and allowed the Chief Justice and the majority of the court to invoke this court-made principle that and eviscerate the 15th Amendment. And, maybe they thought Congress would respond. Maybe they thought, oh, with this warning, obviously Congress will fix the problem. I mean, little did they know how, dysfunctional our Congress really is. And so then it comes back and the court just invokes the principles of Northwest Austin and declares Shelby County, the voting rights unconstitutional. And the 4 liberals who had been on the court were just left to write a dissent, a powerful dissent, I have to say, but one I think they never anticipated they'd have to write. Do you think that's right?
I think so.
Yeah.
And really, the reason that story is so exemplary is that it goes to the heart of your idea of what it means to be a judge.
Right.
And when you talk about learning how to be a judge, you talk about your role models, and the 2 that you name were Judge Learned Hand, who never made it to the Supreme Court, but a highly distinguished appellate judge, and Justice Lewis Powell.
Yeah.
Now, that's a kind of strange role model, Lewis Powell, because he was a very conservative, blue-blooded Southerner who one would not have thought a Democratic appointee would have chosen, named as a role model. But you write in the book that the favorite description that anybody ever wrote about you as a judge was a political progressive and a judicial conservative. So you were widely considered to be one of the liberal judges.
Yeah.
You always, in conversation, kind of resisted a label, not the liberal label, but any label. But talk a bit about how to balance your progressive druthers and your very strong sense of the judicial role.
Yeah. So just a little one factoid here about the 2 judges that Linda mentioned. During the summer of '94, when I was waiting for Senate confirmation, I devoured as many judicial biographies as I could. I figured this is a good way to figure out what my job is. and the 2 that really struck me were Jerry Gunther's fabulous biography of Learned Hand, which, if you ever want to read a biography of a judge, that's the one to read. It's really good, after you read my book. And a really good biography of Justice Powell. Those 2 books, they resonated with me because in both books, the authors emphasized the emphasis in these 2 judges' judicial lives of notions of judicial restraint, of using the awesome power of the courts only when absolutely necessary to protect constitutional individual rights, and things like faithfulness to the Constitution, following precedent, respecting the narrow jurisdiction of courts. I could go on and on. These are principles that these 2 judges, well, 1 judge and 1 justice, use throughout their career. And that, that's what I learned in law school also, Linda. That made sense to me, and most important, those were the tools that I was able to use to separate my own personal views about cases from the law I was supposed to apply. They were limiting these principles of judicial restraint, but they were also enormously reassuring because they left me feeling, all right, I've been able to separate my personal views, and I can prove it because I've written opinions which produce results that are different than I would have done if I had been a member of the Senate. And that's what judging is. And that's what's absent in this Supreme Court.
So our time is fleeting, and I want to save time for questions, but there's one last thing I'll ask you about that struck me. You talk about two cases that, in retrospect, you're sorry you didn't recuse yourself from because of your blindness.
Yeah.
And both of these cases had to do with the visual.
Yeah, right.
With objects that were described to you, that you felt you had an idea of. But talk about those, because for a judge after the fact to say, I should have recused, is kind of a big deal. So.
Yes. So actually, there are three cases.
Three?
Pardon me? Yeah. One case, which Linda didn't ask me about, and I won't talk about unless you all want me to, is a case where I did recuse myself. And by the way, I applied what I describe in the book as the Tatel 5-minute rule. And the Tatel 5-minute rule is very simple. If I had to think about recusal for more than 5 minutes, I recuse myself. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is that it leaned towards recusal. In other words, put the benefit of the doubt in favor of the integrity and impartiality of the courts. The two cases Linda's talking about, remember I said before how writing a memoir makes you think deeply? Had I not written this book, I don't think I would have been saying I should have recused myself in those cases. But I've thought about them a lot. They both one involved currency, dollars and paper currency, and the other involved architectural drawings. And you needed to be able to know exactly what the currency looked like. One involved counterfeiting issues, and the architectural was a copyright case. One architect claimed another had stolen her designs for an embassy. And so you needed to be able to see them. Well, the way I prepared for them is, actually in the currency case, my then, 18, 19-year-old daughter happened to be in the courthouse, and she spent a good couple of hours with me going through these currencies and explaining as carefully as she could the difference between the so-called counterfeit ones and the real ones. And I used my fingers to do it. And then on the copyright one, my clerk did the same thing. And we spent hours trying to understand. And I went ahead and I sat on both cases. I wrote the opinion in the architectural drawings case. It was a long opinion. It had pictures attached. And the currency case was what we call per curiam. There wasn't a written opinion. We wrote it as a group. But so, the more I've thought about that, the more I've thought that what worries me retrospectively, and by the way, I did some tests about this while I was writing the book. I worried that my daughter and my law clerk, who were extremely conscientious about this, were in their description of what they saw, reflecting how they thought the case should be decided. In other words, they knew what the issue was. And I worried that, unlike a copy machine where I would get exactly what was there, I was getting a description that might be subtly influenced by whether they thought it was copyright or whether they thought whether they thought it was a counterfeit. And as I look back on it, I think, I'm the judge, not them. And I had to make the decision. And I think, looking back on it, that I should have allowed another judge to sit on the case for that reason. And there's a second factor, which is related in the other case where I did recuse myself, which is the public's perception. The integrity of our courts, the ability of the courts to perform their mission depends entirely on the public's confidence that the courts are impartial. And I worried in part that the public might think, how can a blind judge make a copyright decision about this? In fact, I was totally offended. The New Yorker wrote a story about the first case, and the defendant, who was a performance artist, was quoted in the New Yorker as complaining that there was a blind judge on the panel, and he made some nasty remark about him even maybe having a guide dog, which I didn't. Anyway, I tell this because, and recusals have been, the country's paid a lot of attention to recusals by judges, and
failure of
or failure to
recusals.
recuse, and I don't comment on any other judge in my book. My book is about the courts, not about justices. And people will have to read my book and decide from that what I think about what other judges have done. But to me, the most important thing for a federal judge is to ensure that that the public is confident, has no basis for questioning, or no reasonable basis for questioning the judge's impartiality. That's so fundamental to the operation of our courts. Federal judges are appointed for life. You can't vote against us if you don't like our decisions. And so the only reason the public respects the courts is that they think or hope the courts are applying objective law to the facts before them. And if the public thinks that that's not happening, the credibility of the courts can be severely hurt. And my own view, Linda, is that one of the reasons why the public respect for the courts is so low now is both because the courts have become so ideological and also because we've had all these questions about recusals and whether judges should recuse. Once there's a public question of whether a judge should recuse, we've lost the battle. The judge should never get in a position where the judge's failure to recuse becomes a public issue.
That's a good point to sort of end this part of our program on, very thought-provoking. And time for questions. And there's a microphone coming around. And, okay, Frank Stewart.
Frank Stewart, New York. If you were empowered to make 3 amendments to the US Constitution, what would they be?
Let me just interject. Justice John Paul Stevens, when he retired, wrote a book with the 6 amendments that he would like to accomplish, like getting rid of the Second Amendment and so on. But over to you, David.
Well, Frank, I can tell you one that I would do. I talk about it in the book, and that is term limits for Supreme Court justices. I was always against them, but now I think they're a good idea. I only spend 3 sentences in the book on them because I don't think they're going to happen. I think Congress isn't going to do it as long as we have a filibuster. And even if it did it, I think the court would declare it unconstitutional, and I think the court might be right about that. But if you gave me this opportunity, if I could amend the Constitution, I would have 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices. I think it would do a couple things. I think it would take the pressure off appointing the youngest possible judges, which is really not healthy for our institutions. It would give every president an opportunity to appoint justices, which would be good for the diversity of the court. And it would prevent people from staying too long and becoming too rigid in their thinking. That's one amendment. I could, if ask me tonight at drinks, I'll come up with 2 more.
Okay, we'll take another question. Up in the balcony.
Larry Einhorn, Indiana. 2 quick questions. You mentioned that it's a lifetime appointment, so they're not beholden to any political party. Do you really think that's true today? Because I don't. And second question is it harder to overturn precedent? Because it seems to be overturned pretty readily these days. I think
faithfulness to precedent is a really important element of our judicial system, and for lots of reasons. Let me just give you one example. When a court composed, say, of a majority of Democratic appointed judges follows a precedent written by a court with a majority of Republican judges, it sends a powerful signal to the public that something objective is going on here, that this is not a political institution. I mean, that's one reason. There's many more reasons. I mean, each constitutional decision of the Supreme Court is itself an interpretation of the Constitution. Now, of course, precedent can be overruled, and the court itself has articulated the standards for doing that. But it's difficult to overturn a precedent, and it should be. And since you asked about precedent, you know, I dare you to read the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs and explain to me why it overruled Roe v. Wade. And to me, this is about judging. An opinion of a court has to be persuasive. If it doesn't explain to you in rational terms, reasonable terms, what laws it's based on, if it can't do that, then you can legitimately suspect that something other than judging is going on here. And when I look at Dobbs, I don't see the reason for overruling Roe other than, as Justice Kagan said, the personnel of the court has changed. You can read Brown by comparison, and you can see exactly why it overruled Plessy. So precedent is important. It has to be changed sometime. Brown's a perfect example. But it should be very difficult to change. And unfortunately, with this court, well, Linda's written about this. You've written a couple of very powerful columns about how quickly precedent falls under this court and how little respect it seems to have for the decisions of earlier courts.
Yeah. Question over there, yeah.
Yes, Roger Smith, University of Pennsylvania.
You want to talk into the mic?
Roger Smith, University of Pennsylvania. Is it not on? Okay.
I want 1 minute.
Thank you both for a wonderful discussion and for your contributions to American constitutionalism. I want to ask the judge his thoughts about issues of disability rights. As you know, there is a controversy amongst disability advocates about whether priorities should go to resources for cure or whether, as a matter of civil rights, we should be adapting our institutions to accommodate participation by people with a wider range of abilities. So the question is, as someone who has performed so successfully in our institutions, do you see that as an important frontier of civil rights development, or do you have some reservations about going far in that direction?
I don't think those are in conflict. I vote for both. I think it's important to enforce our laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability, and I think it's important to adapt our institutions to people with disabilities in reasonable ways. But I also think my book ends, the epilogue of the book. I talk a lot in the book about several disability cases, mainly to talk about the Supreme Court. But in the epilogue of the book, I talk about 3 neuroscientists who are actually restoring sight to blind people. And it's amazing what's happening. And I understand from my scientist friends who are working in this field that what we will see in the next decade in terms of preventing and curing many kinds of blindness will be breathtaking. But great, but it's not a substitute for enforcing the existing laws we have about disability discrimination and bringing people with disabilities into the mainstream. Many people have asked me why I wrote this book. My answer, having written it, is different than when I started to write it. And one of my answers now is I hope this book will demonstrate to people, I hope it'll be inspiring to everybody, but I hope to people, like people who make hiring decisions and say law firms or corporations, I hope they read this book. And that when next time they're looking at 3 applicants and one of them is blind or one of them is deaf or one of them is in a wheelchair, that they just make the decision based on the merits. And that they ensure their institution is capable of responding to the reasonable needs. I tell many of those stories in the book. I've been very fortunate in the extent to which the law firms and courts that I've worked for have accommodated my blindness. And had it not been for that, I wouldn't have succeeded. So I'm for both.
Okay, we have to stop. And David, thank you very much.
Can I say one more thing? Can I say one thing? Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you.
All right.
I'm sorry.
Okay. We are.
Yeah.
Great. So, well, thank you very much to both David and Linda for a remarkable conversation. We now come to a segment of the afternoon program, the final one before we break, in which we celebrate Bob Hauser's time as the executive officer of this society. Now, it's easy enough to list some of the accomplishments of Bob's 7.5 years as executive officer. It must first be remembered that he came into office at a moment when his predecessor was seriously ill and unable to introduce him to the detailed workings of the staff, the committees, and the departments. He solved that problem by producing, in remarkably short order, a strategic plan, an encyclopedic strategic plan, as I think he would characterize it himself. That gave him both the needed knowledge and a sense of purpose to which to apply his remarkable energy. Now, of course, almost anybody can produce a strategic plan. What matters is executing it. And that he did. Those who attended any of the listening sessions held in the process of generating our new strategic plan have heard the list of accomplishments, which are numerous. And they were carried out to a large degree in the face of the vast crisis created by the pandemic, with all of its consequences for our meetings, for staff ability to work with our collections, the violent gyrations in various financial realms, and much more. Bob would be the first to tell you about the contributions of others in the leadership and staff to the fact that we came through those years in far better shape than we might have expected. And in fact, having achieved significant progress, and certainly in much better shape than most other organizations that I know. But he was, after all, the person in charge. Many qualities contributed to Bob's record of achievement at the APS. One was sheer doggedness and determination. To this, perhaps, he might himself attribute the conclusion of years and years of negotiations with the David Library of the American Revolution, leading to the creation of the David Center in the Library and Museum. This has given a notable impetus to the growth and reach of our programs in the early history of this country. But he would also, and importantly, acknowledge areas in which he didn't see problems early enough. And he has mentioned these in many places. But the key quality here, I think, is his ability to grow and to learn, and to refuse to let mistakes compound themselves. That grace and determination has brought us to a dramatic resurrection of the APS press. As Bob and Peter Doherty more or less persuaded one another not to accept failure in the search for a new director of publications. And the two of them have collaborated in such a way that we now have exciting new books, a viable production distribution system in collaboration with the University of Pennsylvania Press, books galore in the pipeline, and a great new director in Kim Gwinta. Another turnaround has enabled us to enter into the era of our Center for the History of Science, with the Adriana Link as its inaugural curator, and to make it a focus of our upcoming capital campaign. Bob has somehow, as he said in recent remarks to the Counsel, come to believe that in all of this he was acting simply as manager. This is manifestly untrue. Everyone who knows him recognizes his wide-ranging intellect and interests, which Patrick alluded to in his remarks earlier. And I cannot think of a single decision we have made in his time that has not involved direct intellectual interest on his part, as he has delved deeply into every subject that has come on the table. Just as his own musical interests have helped make this hall a better and much more used space for musical performance. The leitmotif of inequality, visible in our recent exhibitions, also comes from him. Bob's essential quality as executive officer, I believe, has been his passion for every part of the Society's mission. And that is rooted in the life of the mind, a very capacious mind. This has been the root of our great progress since 2017, and it is this that I ask you to join me in saluting today. Now we have some presentations to make to Bob this afternoon. So we will start with the most meaningful, a message from Bob's son, Josh, who was not able to join us today. So I'm going to sit down and
Hello, my name is Josh Hauser, and I'm Bob's eldest son. I'm professor of trombone at Tennessee Tech University, and I can blame that largely on Bob and Tess. They both had been involved in music growing up, with Tess going on to get a degree in violin and viola. Both my brother Seth and I were encouraged to play string instruments at a young age. I began on cello in 4th grade, and Seth began playing Suzuki violin shortly after that. In middle school, I played euphonium in the school band and cello in our local youth symphony. And when I started high school, I dropped the cello in favor of the trombone. Definitely a wise choice. Unfortunately for Bob and Tess, their example and expectation stuck, and music has been both my vocation and avocation. I have lots of memories of growing up with music in the house, helping my dad to wire speakers to create a whole house system, playing duets with Tess when she would play the left hand of the piano on popular tunes while I played the melody, playing Name That Tune with Bob in restaurants whenever we would hear jazz, trying to ID the song and the artists. One of the other memories I have is of Bob playing the piano. He was not a great player, but he clearly enjoyed it, especially when he would practice Gershwin's piano preludes. I recall how excited he was when we found a recording by Kenny Burrell, a jazz guitarist who we went to see in a club in Detroit on a visit to Tess's parents, playing his version of the second prelude. I also recall going with them to hear a performance by Jeffrey Siegel, who specialized in Gershwin's piano music. Bob has also been kind enough to help support our trombone studio here by purchasing a contrabass trombone for students to play. It is for these reasons that I chose to honor Bob today with a new arrangement for trombone choir of George Gershwin's second piano prelude that includes the contrabass trombone on the bottom. You'll see it being played on the far right of the video. Be sure to listen for the last note, stretching the range of the ensemble down like a giant pipe organ. Dad, thank you for all of your help and encouragement over the years. I'd like to congratulate you on your third and hopefully final attempt at retirement. Let's hope this one sticks.
I'm now going to invite Linda Greenhouse to say a few words as well. You've got ours. Yeah. Yes. I've got that. Yes. Thank you. Oh.
Yes, now? Okay. Yeah, I apologize. So Roger said it all, and Patrick said a bit. So I just want to emphasize a couple of things. One is back in 2017 when we were recruiting for the position of executive officer, I think had it been known that within a couple of years a worldwide pandemic would shut down the APS for 2.5 years, we would have had a lot of trouble finding anybody. And we really owe a great debt to Bob, actually, along with Patrick at the library and Annie Westcott at the meetings, for keeping the place going and thriving in that very difficult period. The other thing I'll emphasize is the extent to which Bob really changed the definition of executive officer and made it the full-time job that it really had not been considered previously. It was kind of a very important, but nonetheless kind of retirement, semi-retirement type of position where the holder of the title was not expected to actually show up necessarily all that often. And Bob got himself an apartment down the street and showed up every day. So it really, it was something that was essential given the complexity that the APS now encompasses, and that was him. So a summer ago, Roger and his wife Whitney came to visit us in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and we live about 5 minutes from the Norman Rockwell Museum. And we were going through the fascinating collection there and noticed a selection of signed original prints signed by Norman Rockwell. And we looked at each other and said, wow, you know, that would make one heck of a gift for the retiring executive officer. And so that being the case, I would like to call Bob up to the stage and present him with this scene of the block on which we are now, well, no, not quite. I think this is Philosophical Hall, and we're here on Chestnut Street, but this is the view of Philadelphia, of old Philadelphia, by the hand of Norman Rockwell, and that is our parting gift to you.
Am I mic'd now?
You are.
Okay, that is just wonderful. And yes, I'm a fan, in spite of all of the negative things that are said about him in the press. I really am impressed with Norman Rockwell, and I loved his work. I still love his work. And my late wife Tess and I used to have a ball. There was one particular painting of a physician and administering something to a young girl in his office. That was a physician in Stockbridge, and when Tess was a student at Tanglewood, she got sick one day and had to go see this guy. So it was really so anyway, Rockwell is wonderfully important, and of course you guys know this stuff. Well, you know what that is, right? But this other stuff, it's a kind of a collage, because no, Franklin's office is not directly in front of the backside of Independence Hall, but it's okay all the same. Thank you. That is just wonderful.
Great.
Do I get to?
So
I should stay up
now
here
we're
and
going to
talk.
give Bob a chance to say something, but before he does, we want you all to raise these glasses that have been passed out and toast Bob, long life and third retirement.
Thank you all.
Bob, you're not obliged to, but if you...
So I don't get to read more of Roger's script. So let me read my script, which I've composed. Should I say, David told us how deeply he thought about things he wrote. I did this on the fly. So let me start at the beginning, especially because Clyde Barker is here. and I remember they had difficulty trying to figure out whether I would fit in here, and so the important thing was my second personal interview here with members of the search committee, and at the close of that, and presumably before the committee had decided who to recruit, Clyde asked me two important questions. What's your drink, and do you like dogs? I mean, obviously, in the part of the legacy of this society, perhaps because Clyde was such a friend of Tom Starzl. But anyway, and gin. And so I gave him the right answer to both questions, and the rest is history. I want to, I guess, say something about Josh. Josh's forte is really the brass quintet. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the outfit that made brass quintet music popular, the Canadian Brass. They were really the first. There are lots and lots. There's a tremendous amount, a large repertoire in many, many brass quintets now. But the Canadian Brass was it. And what happened to cement Josh into his career is that while Josh was attending the National Music Camp at Interlaken, the Canadian Brass came to play one night when all four of us, Seth and Tess and I, were all there at the same time, and bang, that was it. And in fact, later on, much later on, Josh did his doctorate in part under the direction of a trumpet player named Fred Mills, who had been the lead trumpet player for the Canadian Brass for 25 years. Now, so that's cement. Even in high school, his brass quintet was terrific, and 3 of the 5 members became professional musicians, to give you an idea. But I never imagined I'd hear one of his groups play here. And of course, what he didn't say, that's his studio that you heard from Tennessee Technological University, where he taught for many years. And obviously, that is his arrangement for trombone choir of the second prelude, which is, as he well knows, was always my personal favorite. It's still sort of in my fingers, even though I haven't played it for 60-some years. So back to the APS. I guess I want to say the thing that everyone is expected to say on some occasions, but it is certainly true in my case that I am immensely grateful for this opportunity to have flunked retirement for the second time. So I really am truly grateful to all of you, to your as members, staff, those who are not here, as well as those who are here helping make these meetings fly, and also to the friends of the APS, who really are an important source of activity and friendship and support for the society. Being here has been a real treat. I love the mission of the society, promoting useful knowledge. And I'm sort of parroting Roger here a little bit, but I always thought of this when I think of the society in sort of several different kind of what should I say, cliched ways. Every time I have to describe this outfit to somebody else, I say the American Philosophical Society. It's not about philosophy. Think about what philosophy actually means. And then the other line that I use is, of course, this is, and we'll get a taste of this not too long from now, this is Ben Franklin's Thinking, Drinking, and Eating Society. That's another one that I really like. But the important thing is that it's about everything. And I spent my 2 careers in 2 different places that focused on one thing. In one case, it was social science, as broadly conceived as I can make it, but not all that broad. And the other thing, it was a policy shop at the National Academy of Sciences, something totally different, again, from what I had done previously. And then this is totally different yet a third time, because it really is about everything, and it has just been a kick. It's been 7.5 years. I'm a slow learner, so 7.5 years of education have been just wonderful. Roger mentioned some of the big things that went on during the time I've been in this position. Oh, I have to say one other thing, especially because Linda mentioned the fact that I took this on as a full-time job. Those people on the search committee didn't tell me that it wasn't. And in my ignorance, I assumed that it was. So there I was. So Roger mentioned some of the big things, the David Center, the APS Press, and the wonderful improvements of this hall that have been really a kind of a collaborative effort among the society, the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society, Carnegie Hall, Marlborough, and several foundations. So those are big things. There's some smaller things. Oh, we've gotten rid of that screen. That's good. You notice some of our great founders here. Wonderful portraits. Sully, Peel, Stewart, all slaveholders. And every time I see that in this hall, I say, gee whiz, this is a wonderful hall, but oh my goodness. We have much to revere them about, but there are other things. And one of the things that I am proudest of here is that, as I think Roger mentioned, we have arranged so that every one of the museum exhibitions that have been held here during my tenure has had some kind of a focus on past inequalities and their amelioration. And that's been a big part of my vision for the society. And I was assured by Mary Grace Wall, who runs the museum, yesterday that will continue in the exhibitions to come. And the other thing is something that Patrick and I did together. It's the only thing we've written together, and we're not listed as authors, but there is a statement about the APS inequality in the 2020 APS News, which, among others, which goes into our really terrible history. We had slavery, we had pseudoscientific race science, and we had eugenics. And all of those were supported to one degree or another by our membership. Not only supported, but facilitated. I mean, really. There were principals, Samuel George Morton, for one. We decided to try to say something that would reimagine and relabel the society, and that's what we call the APS idea. There's all this DEI stuff. We didn't like DEI. The APS idea, IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And that's what we have hoped to create within the society. We have certainly been doing very well, I think, as a starter, both in terms of our elected membership, in terms of our staffing, and in one particular aspect of our elected membership, and that is increasing the number of Native American members of the society. And we've been able to do that really quite successfully in a temporary nominating group. And with no, with extraordinary people. I guess you heard Bob Miller, if you were here last time, you heard Bob Miller talk about the Oklahoma case. And he is, I think he was the second Native American to be elected to membership in the society. But I think there are going to be 8 or 9 now who have been elected in the course of my term. And I love that. Now, just a couple of more things before I quit. I've got about a minute. I want to say a word for Montgomery Blair High School. Where's David? Is he? He left. That's too bad. Because we have 2 sessions in a row here. One involving David Tatel and the other involving me. And both of us attended Montgomery Blair High School in Silver Spring, Maryland. Okay. And I want to close with some advice to my successor and really close compatriot for 6 years, and more now since he's been here back here since July, and that's Patrick Spero. It has been a joy to work with Patrick. I think it is very difficult to untangle the accomplishments that have supposedly been associated with me in the course of this afternoon's festivities, and those of Patrick during his term as librarian. He has really been an inspiration and a fantastic colleague for me throughout that time. But I want to give some very important advice to him as he takes over my role. If you leave this building through the front door and turn left, in half a block you will reach 4th Street. If you turn left if you cross the street and then turn left and go up several doors, you will find Dave's Barbershop. Now, Dave's Barbershop, you may not know this already, but Dave's Barbershop is an exceptionally important institution and carries a great legacy for the APS. Herman Goldstein got his haircut there. Ted Carter got his haircut there. I get my haircut there, and by God, Patrick better start getting his haircut there. So I thank you all.
Right. Okay. A few last closing remarks. One other tribute to Bob is that the Council authorized creating the Robert Mason Hauser Fund to support young scholars in our research grants program with a focus on HBCUs, tribal institutions, and other minority-serving institutions. So far, we have raised almost $100,000 for this endowment fund, and we will continue to work on it. And we hope that it will help carry forward at least 1 or 2 of the ideals that Bob has brought to this role. We are now slightly past the conclusion of our session. Council members will please head across the street to Philosophical Hall. Anybody else who is not incarcerated in the council is welcome to tour the exhibition with Mary Grace Wall. That will remain open until 6. And David Tatel is available to sign copies of his book in the Fells Room. So you have options for your entertainment for the time until 6 o'clock, when the reception will begin in this room, which will have been transformed in all sorts of ways. Thank you very much.